Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. We are going to give it a little bit of time to let people log in and access the webinar. So I'll take a little bit of time. And if you could right now access the chat, we'd love to know who's joining us and where from. So if you want to find the chat window and utilize that, I am currently in our offices in Denver, as are many of our colleagues from the DC area today. We have a organization-wide retreat. Okay, so we've got Alaska. Wonderful. Thanks for joining us, Representative. Anyone else who's tuned in, we'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Alaska, I'm sure it's you're very interested in microgrids right now. It's one of the primary use cases that people have been talking about. Georgia, Colorado, Oregon, wonderful. All right, they're all piling in now. So with that, I'm gonna get us started. So again, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, Microgrids, State and Industry Efforts to Enhance Energy Resilience. My name is Dan Shea. I am a program principal in NCSL's energy program, and I will be your moderator today. This is the second webinar. If we could advance the slides, please. This is the second webinar in the National Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee's 2022 Spring Webinar Series. We have a total of 5 webinars lined up over the course of the next couple of months on a variety of topics, including state efforts to protect vulnerable road users, school bus electrification, and state policy options related to that, and the benefits of wildlife infrastructure. For the full schedule and registration details, please visit our website at ncsl.org. Let's move to the next slide, please. So while this webinar is part of the NRI webinar series, it is also the kickoff webinar in another series of webinars that NCSL is hosting focused on energy resilience. A bit confusing, I realize, but here's the basics and what you really need to know. In addition to today's webinar on microgrids, we will also be hosting 2 more webinars on May 26th and June 16th. These are not part of the NRI webinar series. The focus of those will be on hardening electric infrastructure and the funding and financing mechanisms that states and utilities rely on to do so. And the other one will be on identifying and mitigating risk, which will look at utility and state planning practices aimed at mitigating the impact of disruptions. All 3 of these webinars are developed with the support of the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Security, Cybersecurity, and Emergency Response. And you can email me at the email address on the screen right now if you would like further information on those, but do keep an eye out for communication. Next slide, please. Finally, before we really dive into today's proceedings, I want to take a couple of moments to highlight an upcoming report from NCSL. In the next couple of weeks, we will be releasing a new report on microgrids. The report offers some of the basics and background information on microgrids, a discussion on the primary use cases and drivers, along with an overview of state legislation. Among the findings, only a handful of states have established substantive microgrid policies through legislation. These are the states and territories that you see in green on the map. Among these policies, states have worked to establish microgrid tariffs, standardize the interconnection process, and address the use of utility right-of-ways. More than 15 other states have included microgrids, along with many other technologies in other policies or programs through, again, this is through legislation, not regulation or any other policy format. These are the states you see in orange. So examples of those policies include creating grant programs or funding technical support, authorizing funding through state green and resilience banks, and more recently, including microgrids under commercial property assessed clean energy programs, also known as PACE. But for today's webinar, we have a really great lineup of speakers, so I don't want to take any additional time from them. I'll just ask everyone to keep an eye out for the report, which we will promote through a variety of means, including the NRI committee and our energy supply task force and energy newsletter plugged in. So for today's presentation, before I really introduce everyone, I need to review a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. So throughout the webinar, we do encourage participation through our chat. Quite a few of you have already engaged in that, and we appreciate your engagement there. So feel free to type in your questions or to answer any questions that you see in the chat box on your screen. Feel free to use the chat to populate the chat with questions whenever they come up throughout the webinar today. We will be referencing the chat to pull questions for presenters. So the earlier you do that, the easier it is for us to line those up. And finally, the webinar is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar and presentation slides on NCSL's website following the completion of the webinar. We'll send out a notice of those resources once they're available. So finally, the programming you came for. With the growing frequency and intensity of natural disasters, microgrids are quickly gaining steam as a suite of technologies that can help businesses, communities, and even individual homeowners to ride out costly disasters and utility outages. However, their role during disasters can overshadow some of the other important services that microgrids can provide during normal operations. Due to the newness of these systems, they can often face a variety of financial and regulatory barriers to development. Our panelists today will discuss the technologies, financing options, and regulatory mechanisms that states have pursued to break down some of these barriers and facilitate microgrid development. So joining us today, we have Don Wingate, the Vice President of Sales for Microgrid Solutions and Strategic Partners at Schneider Electric. Sam Cramer is a Senior Program Director at the National Association of State Energy Officials, also known as NASIO. And Luam Tesfaye is the Chief of Staff and Legal Advisor for California PUC Commissioner Genevieve Sharoma. So a big thank you to all of you for participating today. First up, we have Don Wingate. As mentioned, Don is the Vice President of Sales, Microgrid Solutions and Strategic Partners at Schneider Electric. Schneider has been a leading company in developing microgrid solutions and pioneering new business models to enable microgrid development. In his role, Don leads the North American business development efforts for microgrid solutions and manages the power and grid segment focused on strategic utility accounts. So Don, we are thrilled to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
All right, hey, thank you so much, Sam, and thank NCSL for the opportunity to present today and share some information. I know that the topic of the conversation is resilience, but we always try at Schneider Electric to link resilience and sustainability together. You know, it might be pretty simple to say, okay, let's add a lot of diesel generation to everyone's home and every business, but I don't think that's going to get the right result. So maybe advance the slide, please. Because when we look at this, you know, we've got to do a lot as a community, as a country, to really help make our environment better. And you know, we have a limit that's up there to try and reduce global heating by 1.5 degrees centigrade. And we are a long way from getting to the finish line. And I think one of the points that I'd like to make today is that we really have to add urgency to this, and we have to do this resiliency and sustainability together, do it fast, and make sure that we can help meet the goals that we have as a country, as different states, and do this in a responsible manner. So we can switch again. And looking at some trends that we're seeing in the industry, you know, electrifying, electricity is a really good way to get things done. And we're going to find really the doubling of electricity requirements over the next 15 years, whether it's the electrification of transportation, whether it's making buildings more efficient, whether it's adding new technologies to replace coal. The decarbonization effort is occurring, as it says on the chart. Only 6% of our energy right now is done sustainably. That's going to go to more decarbonization. Microgrids are going to be the impetus for decentralization. A tremendous amount is forecasted to be put in place over the next 5 years. And the usage, the buildings, for example, we've got to digitize. We've got to make things more efficient. We've got to half the build, 50% of the buildings in America are over 50 years old. We've got to make them more effective and more efficient, and that goes to resiliency. So Mike, let's check the next slide, please. Microgrids, maybe we start with a leveling of what a definition is. And when I look at a microgrid, it's really an integrated system where we look at lots of different sources of energy, whether that be solar, whether that be some sort of rotating equipment, wind. We look at different sources of energy. We have to have an ability to store that energy effectively. And it has to be tied to flexible loads so that when we're looking at things, we have ways to cut back on certain capabilities, use it more efficiently. And all these things have to be put together and be able to run in parallel with the traditional grid and also act in an islanded mode. Next slide. There's really, as we look at it, sort of three ways of looking at these advanced microgrids. They've got to earn their stripes every 24/7, every day of the year. So in this grid tied mode, they've got to be used for sustainability. They've got to be used for cost optimization, and they have to provide benefits. They're not just used for backup. But the grid itself has to be there, but it's not always there. So these microgrids have to be able to island from the grid and be able to manage the different blackouts that occur and still do that to optimize the costs and sustainability. And when the grid's out for more than a few minutes, they have to be able to operate in an off-grid manner so that you can use the energy that you've stored and locally generated really behind the meter, do that more effectively. So next slide. So, you know, when we talk to our end users, they're always looking for three things. They're looking for cost savings and stability and predictability of their energy cost. They're looking at sustainability, whether it be the ESG goals that they have to meet, the reporting of their goals to credit agencies, and resiliency to make sure that their processes, their heating, their cooling, everything has to be resilient now. It's been made more apparent with things that have happened with storms and global warming. People need to have that resiliency. And when I look at it, it's really interesting that people are saying, I want to take more control of my energy right now. I want to be cost effective. I got to be sustainable. I want to be resilient. And there are a lot of things that are causing that. So if you can jump to the next slide, please. We're really being disrupted. The grid is been under duress when you think about it, whether it's the massive temperature swings we've had in severe weather. There's these billion-dollar disaster events that occur, whether it be wildfires in California, hurricanes and snowstorms in the south in Texas. The warming trends that are happening that are really causing things that to break that they weren't designed to handle. And it's a huge cost. It's a cost to society. It's a cost to states. It's a cost to local businesses. And it's something that we just can't afford to handle anymore. We've got to be more resilient. And one of the key ways to do that is to have a more distributed grid. So if you can switch one more slide, please. So what are the barriers? You know, when we talk to different, whether it's the utility industry or major customers or even residential users, the interconnection is often a costly and time-consuming thing. We got to make it easier for people to put in these more distributed resources. I always like to say that the utility industry model is broken. The grid was designed 100 years ago. It was designed for one-way flow of energy, and now we've got to have two-way flows of energy. It's hard to cross property boundaries in many states. There's restrictions that are in place that have to, for behind-the-meter solution. Things aren't optimized and digitized more effectively. And even when you have different stakeholders involved, let's say you put a microgrid in a county government agency or a bus charging depot, The utility wants to be able to have access and control it, yet somebody that owns that might not want that to occur. So there's got to be rules in order to make things more optimized. And oftentimes the legislative efforts have the best of intentions, and the regulatory actions aren't always aligned with that. And I think that there's got to be a greater sense of urgency to tie, let's make the legislative efforts and the utility commissions work closer, because we don't have a lot of time. We've got to make these things happen much more effectively. So next slide, please. And what I hope you might get is that microgrids really can work. There's a tremendous amount of benefits, but so why haven't they been deployed? And I think there's three things that cause issues. One is they're expensive. There's capital required, and many, whether it be agencies, the utilities, commercial and industrial customers, they might have other needs for their capital. Whenever you do something for the first time, you might not get it right. So they're complex to build, and sometimes they can be complex to operate. And risk is the third one, is if you don't have the capital, if you're not sure how to do things with of the complexity of it, that means it's a risk to your business. So those are impediments to it. And so what's the solution, right? Next slide, please. One area that we're finding is that there's a new business model called energy as a service. And energy as a service is when we transfer what's normally done through a CapEx environment to an energy as a service model. I can give you examples of how we've worked with a county government that wanted to put in a microgrid at their public safety headquarters. We went to them and we said, here's a new model. Let's say no capital up front. We will design, build, own, operate, and maintain the microgrid for a long-term period of 10, 15, 25 years. We'll tell you exactly what the cost of energy is going to be. We're going to guarantee resiliency. We're going to provide more sustainable energy to use. And in essence, take the constraints of money that would have had to been paid, use that for another purpose, and the energy as a service provider will be your energy partner for a long period of time and meet those three objectives. So it's a different approach. Capital is just fine, but energy as a service is really kind of the center of the bullseye over the next decade. So I'm going to turn it over to the rest of my panel. I just want to remind people that Schneider Electric, we were voted the most sustainable company in the world in 2021. We think that that's the foundation of making things more resilient, and we want to make ourselves available to help, whether it be the state officials, the regulatory commissions, the utilities, or the end users get on the new energy transition. Thanks very much, Sam.
Thank you, Don. That was a great introduction and really provided a lot of context around the role microgrids can play and what they look like. Also helpful to hear about the ways that industry is working to overcome some of those financing hurdles that you mentioned. Those are actually the financing and funding discussions flow really nicely into our next presentation, which will look at some of the state and federal financing options for microgrids. So hoping to outline some of those points is Sam Cramer, a senior program director with NASIO. Sam supports NASIO's financing program and electricity planning initiative and conducts research on a range of issues, including work on microgrids, which he will be touching on today. Sam, it's all yours.
All right, can you hear me?
You are good, yep, you're good to go.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. My name is Sam Cramer, and like Dan said, I am a senior program director at NASIO, focusing on our state energy financing and planning work. If we can go to the next slide. First thing I want to do is talk about NASIO. NASIO is a bit of a sister organization to NCSL. We are the only national nonprofit association for the governor-designated energy officials from each of the 56 states and territories, as well as the District of Columbia. We have been around since the early 1980s, and we have basically been the support arm and the voice of the state energy offices, both in DC and across the country. We provide technical assistance and support to them in a number of different areas, engage them regionally through and foster cross-cutting dialogues, and also help facilitate best practice sharing among their peers. Since there are a lot of things going on at the state level, we want to make sure our members are aware of the best of what's going on in every state. And we also do a little bit of lobbying on behalf of the interests of our members on Capitol Hill here in DC. So if we go to the next slide, please. We've got a number of programs and priorities. I'll just leave these up here for a second. So we really cover the gamut. So I focus primarily on our financing and planning work, like I said earlier. And then I've gotten my hands dirty a number of different topics here. So if we go to the next slide. So what I first want to talk about is a working group we have put together with another one of our sister organizations, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC. This map shows that we've got a number of states in this working group, and it's designed to basically provide technical assistance and support to state energy officials and public utility commissioners that are looking to learn more about microgrids and get more information. This resulted in a number of briefing papers as well as webinars focused on different aspects of microgrid design development, as well as policy and regulatory aspects to support microgrid growth and scalability. And one of these is going to be the paper I will be talking to you about now. If you go to the next slide, here's the agenda for today. I'll touch on that in a second, but I think the important thing to understand here is that, while Don is talking about why we definitely need microgrids, I think I have the really important job here of telling us, where the heck we're going to get the money to fund these microgrids. Microgrids are expensive and they cost a lot of money, but fortunately there are ways to make this advantageous to the consumer, and I'm going to talk about that. We'll talk about some of the cost drivers and revenue streams from microgrids. We'll talk about some of the, since Don has covered energy as a service and performance contracting, we'll talk about a couple other financing models, but really get into some of the nitty-gritty of state funding programs, and then some actions we've recommended in the paper that energy offices and utility commissions can take to support microgrid funding and financing efforts. We can go to the next slide, please. So obviously, we'll briefly touch on this since Don covered it for the most part, but there's a lot of things to like about microgrids. They can support the grid, they provide grid hardening, they can provide ancillary services to the grid. There's a lot of benefits that having microgrids in a community can provide. They keep critical facilities working when the lights go out and when we have a black start event. So it's really helpful for all communities to have these facilities available. But the question is especially as they get more complicated, microgrids can cost a significant amount of money, and so we need to think of new ways in order to leverage capital and make the cost of constructing microgrids more affordable and achievable for customers who wish to install them, whether that's a state or local government or a much market entity, a municipality, universities, schools, hospitals, critical facilities, and just private sector customers as well. So fortunately, as we've worked on financing in the energy office and utility arena, our understanding of financing has gotten to be more sophisticated over the last 30 years, and there are a number of mechanisms available. We'll talk about those a little bit as well. Go to the next slide. So there are really four different parts to the microgrid construction and development cycle, and each one of these parts is going to have different cost drivers. The feasibility study stage is really kind of the very beginning initial planning. We're trying to think through how a microgrid might be sited, what are potential revenue streams that could come from it, depending on what sort of generation you're thinking about including in the microgrid, or what services you're thinking about the microgrid to provide. It's really the beginning planning stages, and most of the costs of this come for the costs that a customer would hire a firm to conduct this study. Then we go to the design phase where you're actually designing the technical aspects of the microgrid and really kind of figuring out what goes where and how the microgrid's going to operate. These costs can be pretty significant. They can comprise 4 to 10% of the total cost of the entire process. And it's depending on the firm that you're hired to design the microgrid, as well as the complexity of the microgrid you're looking to design itself. Then we go to the construction phase, which is actually building out the microgrid. No surprise here, actually procuring generation assets for microgrid is going to be the largest share of these costs. The microgrid, the total cost for this is probably going to be about 54 to 76% in this phase. So much of the costs, as you'd expect, are going to go into the actual construction. And the soft costs can be up to like 10 to 45% of that money. So it's not an insignificant amount. And then finally, you've got operation and maintenance of the system, where you're really focusing on routine and unexpected maintenance as parts decay, as they fall apart. That's going to cost money to repair and make sure the microgrid is in peak condition. So, in the event of the lights going out, the microgrid's able to switch itself on. So if we go to the next page, obviously we've got a lot of different costs that go to a microgrid, but fortunately there are a lot of revenue streams that are unique to microgrids that they can take advantage of. And I'll touch on a few of these here. If you just click through the slide here, you'll get all of the different ones up, which is what I need. So first is obviously, if there are existing federal or state or utility incentives out there that for microgrids to take advantage of, you're definitely going to want to take advantage of those. If you're in a state with a renewable portfolio standard, for example, you can have the microgrid generate RECs and get those sold back into the market, particularly if your state has an SREC market and the microgrid's installing solar. That can be a huge source of revenue. Another big one is actually demand response. Microgrids, especially if they have generation sources attached to them, like combined heat power systems or storage or solar, can really be used to help provide grid stability and resiliency for the grid. It can help kind of levelize some of those electricity spikes. So microgrids being paid to provide demand response or other ancillary services is going to be a pretty significant source of revenue for the microgrid over time. And it's also semi-predictable, which is always helpful for financiers, so they know what they're getting in terms of their repayment schedule. Additionally, microgrids that have generation assets can also sell that generation back to the grid if needed, which can provide another revenue stream as well. There are other revenue streams out there, including non-wires alternatives, distribution support service agreements, local energy market participation. There are some subsidies. If your state has storage subsidies, that can be also used as well. But those are going to be the main ones at this time that a lot of microgrids have focused on in terms of their revenue streams. We go to the next slide. So the question is how do we really get to those revenue streams and work through how to make sure that you've got the capital available in order to get the microgrid in place so you can take advantage of them. So obviously Don touched on energy as a service and performance contracting in his presentation, so I won't do that. I'll just touch quickly on commercial property assessed clean energy as it has been used for microgrids. If you go to the next slide. It's basically a financing model that uses a special assessment on a customer's property taxes in order to finance the procurement and installation of energy efficiency and renewable energy improvements on buildings. That's about as brief as I can get on that without getting too into the weeds there. But we have seen it been used in single building microgrids. There is one in Hartford, Connecticut, where the building owner used CPACE to finance battery storage and backup generation in addition to energy efficiency measures for the building, because they wanted to make sure that the building had that black start capability in the event of a natural disaster or a nor'easter. So they paid it, they used a little bit more in terms of CPACE for that. But anyway, it is one way to take advantage of things. It can be used in combination with other financing mechanisms and can also be used as gap financing. A lot of times you'll see folks use it in place of mezzanine debt if they're already going to be making efficiency improvements. So go to the next slide here. What I really want to talk about, though, is really thinking through the roles of public funding versus private funding for microgrid projects. So there are basically two types of funding sources here. They basically get divided into two buckets. There's grants and there's financing. So far in the nascent microgrid industry, what we've seen so far is a lot of these microgrids, especially with state and local governments, have been funded primarily and almost exclusively by grant programs. It has an advantage of providing a predictable amount of money that you can use to build the microgrid. It works really well for these early stage microgrids and for thinking through pilot programs and other ideas, proof of concept examples, which is great. What we're finding, is as we're getting more and more microgrids kind of put onto the grid, we want to find a more sustainable way to use those dollars. As every state and the legislator knows, that states have a limited amount of funding they get to use every year, and so we want to find ways to make sure that that funding is being leveraged as best it can, so we can really maximize the impact of each dollar that gets sent out by the state. So financing is certainly a way to do that. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But what we're finding is that, given what states have been doing, the key here is not whether you want to use only grants or financing, it's how to target them. You want to target grants primarily in the first two stages of that microgrid process I talked about earlier. Grants for the feasibility design and the design stage, because those are the stages where the microgrid, is still kind of under development, and while financing providers may be involved, there's no actual revenue stream involved yet. So all of those costs are being shifted onto the customer. And so if you can provide grants to help kind of cover those costs and get to the microgrid construction development part, makes it a lot more sustainable for financing to be involved. So given that, why don't we talk about some financing products that have been released at the state level that can help with microgrid development. So if we go to the next slide here. There's a number of things on the left here. I'll go through these pretty quickly because I don't want to take up too much more time, but we'll go to the next slide here. So the first thing that I just want to make sure we talk about is revolving loan funds. These are near and dear to the hearts of many state energy officials across the nation. They've been around since the 1980s. They received a huge boost with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds. And so now about 36 states have one or more active revolving loan funds in place. A lot of energy officials and utility commissioners have strong familiarity with these programs. They can offer below market rate financing. The challenge here is that because a lot of these funds were established with ARA Capital, that means all the provisions that come with ARA Capital apply, including Davis-Bacon, Buy American, reporting provisions, NEPA, historic, and that can make it challenging. Sometimes, you'll see a private entity will look at the ARA funds with a little bit lower interest rate, but end up choosing private capital because there's more flexibility in private capital in terms of the things it can buy or the reporting requirements. And so there's certainly a role for revolving loan funds, but sometimes it can be a little bit of a challenge depending on whether they've been using ARA capital or not. So if we go to the next slide, obviously states can produce a lot of grant and incentive programs, and several states have done this. We feature the New Jersey Town Center Microgrid program, where the state provided almost like a mini competition or just a mini incentive program to 13 municipalities to develop feasibility studies and technical designs for town center microgrids to go go across the state. So that's currently ongoing right now, but that's been one way they've been spurring municipalities to develop microgrids, is just providing the cash. Next slide. Another one is green banks. We've had more and more of our energy offices have been interested in green bank establishment and development over the years, because they're looking at the success of existing banks in Connecticut, Hawaii, California, the District of Columbia, Rhode Island, you name it. The green banks are really good at finding niches to provide gap financing to areas that other private capital lenders wouldn't necessarily be as excited about. And so, for example, in Connecticut, the Green Bank offers a microgrid finance program as a way to help provide some of the necessary capital to finance microgrid construction in the state. So as green banks continue to mature and develop and get capital, they're finding that microgrids are an area where they are really well positioned to provide that financing to customers in combination with some grant financing from the state, grant funding from the state. If we go to the next slide. Green bonds, that's another emerging class of bond. It's basically a version of direct bond financing, where the state takes out a bond in order to finance the microgrid. And that's been used to good effect for Camden County. I believe they have it's going to be a first in the nation waste to energy supported microgrid, which is actually a really interesting project. I highly recommend you check it out. The next slide. Competitive grants. This is the New York Prize program I think we're featuring most prominently. It was a way of having municipalities basically compete for funding from the state by designing microgrids to meet the state's criteria. So it helped the state meet its energy goals, but also help municipalities get into the game with microgrids by and sending them to get more funding. So it's kind of a variant of the earlier grant and incentive programs we talked about. And then the next slide. And then finally, there's also utility rate recovery. We've seen this most prominently in the Bronzeville microgrid in Commonwealth Edison's territory in Illinois. But it basically means the utility, instead of a private entity, is owning or operating the microgrid. This can help reduce some of the issues around, around interconnection with the utility or right-of-ways, since the utility is already owning the right-of-ways anyway. And it also can help provide, the microgrid help provide siting for the microgrid that provides optimal support for the grid, since the utility knows where the grid's going to need the most help. So we go to the next page. We can talk about these for a second, but I'm going to leave these slides for your edification. I think I'm almost out of time here. So I want to go to the next slide and basically highlight these are some of the actions that energy offices and utility commissions can take. And I think the most important thing to take away here is really, you got to get the policy right, and you have to get the regulatory environment right if you're going to get microgrids to thrive. I've talked earlier in this presentation about the idea of new rate structures that microgrids can use, where you want to provide public funding, how you want to provide public funding, how you can enable public-private capital financing options like CPACE and ESPC. Not all states have CPACE to take advantage of in their jurisdictions, and a lot of states don't have strong ESPC programs that provide the technical assistance customers may need to navigate through them, like say at Colorado or Maryland. But there are ways that energy offices and utility commissions are both well positioned to take advantage of what they can do in terms of ideally providing a stable and consistent regulatory environment. And I think the other thing is this, trying to find ways to help kind of standardize this microgrid product. You talk to any financier, they always, the thing they love is standardization. If you can standardize something, you can scale it up because you understand the predictability of it. The challenge with microgrids is that, every microgrid is going to be a little different in terms of the buildings it's connecting or the regulatory environment it's in. So that makes it a little more of a challenge, but it's still possible to kind of maybe standardize parts of this process and make it a little bit easier. So with that said, I think we're on the last slide. Go to the next slide. And I will sit back and let the next speaker have it.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. Thank you, Sam. And yeah, great work on the report. I will note that NASIO and NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, have worked together on several reports on microgrids at this stage, and I'm happy to share those with anyone who is interested. I can say that they were very useful in the development of NCSL's forthcoming report. We do reference them and provide links in that report. I also want to take a quick moment to remind people, do not hold out on those questions until the end. I would encourage you to put those questions in the chat now if you've got something brewing. I know that several of you have, and that really helps to line up the Q&A to move smoothly moving forward. So Sam mentioned the sort of regulatory environment and the policy side of things, and that will be our final portion of the presentation. And it was regulations developed out of state legislation. So our third presenter is Luam Tesfaye. Luam serves as the Chief of Staff and Legal Advisor to California Public Utilities Commissioner Genevieve Sharoma. Her portfolio includes microgrids, resilience, energy efficiency, transmission permitting, and energy rate making. So Luam, thank you for joining us today. We are excited to hear from you. So take it away.
Great. Thank you, Dan, for that introduction. And it's great to follow Dawn and Sam and giving everyone, the primer on what a microgrid is, what technologies are out there, and then Sam's great presentation on the research that's being done across the country on being able to stand up microgrids, finance them, and deploy them. So I'm looking forward to giving you a firsthand account of commercialization of microgrids coming from California. And I'll be focusing on implementation of Senate Bill 1339, which was signed into law in California in 2018, carried by Senator Henry Stern. But taking a step back, in California, we have been able to fund about 40 microgrids, kind of starting around 2015 to the present, through our EPIC program, which is a research and development program that is funded by ratepayers It's about $160 million a year program. And a portion of those dollars have gone towards microgrids, research and development, how to scale technologies. I saw a question in the chat from Denise Evans about military funding. And so I did want to quickly mention that funding from that program, from that research and development program, have gone to military installations. And with a focus on microgrids, I wanted to turn your attention to the Marine Corps Air Station at Miramar down in San Diego. Has been a real leader in development of microgrids at military installations. They've received significant funding from California and have been an excellent partner. So if you have any military installations in your state that are looking to develop microgrids, I would turn them to General Woodworth, who is the Marine Corps General for the Southwest installations, and his team there as a great resource, and they do a lot of tours. But getting to SB 1339, the purpose of this legislation was to move us past research and development and move us towards commercialization and broad-scale deployment of microgrids. And I'll be going through a couple of components of that legislation. But one thing I wanted to start with is that there was a really key component of the legislation, which was kind of a boundary to some of the work that we were doing on not shifting costs on customers. And so this is an issue that we see in a lot of different areas of energy regulation, but is so important. We see it a lot with net energy metering and rooftop solar. But as you have customers deploying microgrids on their site, their volumetric use goes down. And so you have significant issues related to the collection of fixed costs on the system. And so that's why it was really important for the legislature to put those bounds on the implementation of the legislation to minimizing cost shift. And even though that might have made my job a little bit more difficult, I think it was a really important component in order to make sure that customers who don't have access to microgrids don't get hit with extra costs because certain customers are able to deploy them. But here, starting at one, we worked very closely with Senator Stern in the development of this legislation and making sure that we had the staffing. And so that is something, as you work with your Public Service Commission or Public Utilities Commission on developing this type of legislation for commercialization of microgrids, work really closely with them on making sure that you have the right staffing in place. So besides the components of the legislation that I'll get into in detail, it did authorize us to fund about 10 staff members. So that includes economists and policy analysts. That includes engineers that are doing, helping us do technical studies and understanding what augmentation we can do safely to tariffs and managing those stakeholder processes. Also funded attorney time as well as administrative law judge time. And so this is just something that I strongly advocate for as legislatures develop these bills, are working closely with your Public Service Commission to make sure that they are adequately staffed to implement the legislation. In addition to that, we have our formal proceeding for implementing the legislation, but we also have a Microgrids and Resiliency Working Group, which has been a really important venue to discuss ideas outside of the formal process and then be able to work on proposals that come into the formal process for implementation in the proceeding. And so I wanted to mention that under the umbrella of resources as well as formal and informal stakeholder processes. So moving ahead and looking at the components of the legislation. And so here we're trying to reduce barriers and support commercialization. And a key component of how we've been deploying microgrids in California has been focused on resiliency. So our proceeding is called Microgrids and Resiliency, and how we can leverage microgrids as a key form of climate adaptation and energy resiliency. So in California, you may have heard about some devastating wildfires that we have faced and efforts to reduce ignition of wildfires by shutting off components of the electric system. And so microgrid deployment is a tool of several for reducing wildfire risk, as well as keeping communities energized who might be affected by what we call public safety power shutoffs. And so there were a number of key components of that legislation. I mentioned cost shifting already, and that's a top line concern that you should always work on with your public service commission to make sure that you don't have any unintended consequences by wide-scale deployment of microgrids. Also, data sharing. As we are working to reduce barriers to deploying microgrids as required by the legislation, data sharing has been a key component of that. And so through the proceeding in California, we have ordered our utilities to develop data sharing portals that are shared with communities, local governments, public safety offices, so that they understand what their need for a microgrid is, for them to understand what components of the distribution system and the transmission system affect them, so that they can make an educated understanding on if they need to be deploying and investing in microgrids. Microgrids are not the solution to all of our problems. As Dawn and Sam have outlined, microgrids can be very expensive and microgrids can be very unique. And so you have to make sure that a community is able to understand what their connection is to their distribution and transmission system so that they can make an educated understanding on if they should be investing in a microgrid or not. Shifting to clean resources. And so this has been a key component of tariff development in California, particularly around microgrids, and moving away from backup generation like diesel that sometimes are used at microgrids. Another component of the shift to clean resources is investment in long duration energy storage. Right now, a lot of the energy storage that is connected to a microgrid is about 4 hours in duration, the lithium batteries that we're familiar with. And so if you're trying to leverage a microgrid for a 2 to 3 day outage, you're not going to be able to completely rely on a 4-hour battery. We know that solar doesn't shine all throughout the day. And a lot of microgrids that are being deployed are trying to leverage solar as a component. Some microgrids are also leveraging natural gas, particularly through fuel cells. And so that is a lower emission way to deploy a microgrid and try and not have to leverage diesel. But there are some restrictions there, right? Some microgrids are going to be located in areas that don't have easy access to a gas line. And so that is a limitation for some microgrids that might want to leverage natural gas or a fuel cell if they're not actually close to a natural gas line. And, we often talk about how microgrids can be leveraged to support remote communities. And those are the same remote communities that might not have access to natural gas. And so California has been investing in long duration energy storage research in order to try and pair long duration energy storage with, for example, microgrids to keep them as clean as possible. I also want to talk about our microgrid incentive program. So last year, the California Public Utilities Commission adopted our microgrid incentive program, and that's a $200 million program funded by ratepayer dollars. So this is coming from customer bills, and we take that very seriously. And so the microgrid incentive program, the $200 million is split statewide, primarily through our 3 electric utilities, Pacific Gas and Electric, Southern California Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric. And these dollars are focused equitably on communities, our most vulnerable, disadvantaged communities, particularly those that have been affected by 2 or more electricity outages in the past year. And so that program is really focused on equipping these communities with resources in order to invest in a microgrid in their community. And reflecting back on Sam's presentation and the many other areas of funding that are available, particularly, an example being like the BRIC program from FEMA and others, as well as financing. A large goal of this program is to allow communities to leverage these dollars in combination with other revenue sources in order to stand up a sustainable microgrid in their community. And then again, we're focusing on trying to get clean microgrids into the communities. And there are some technological barriers there, but we're continuing to look at what technologies are out there and what can be deployed to help support these communities that are especially vulnerable. A key component of that program also, though, is that these microgrids are going to be testing technologies that we're trying to scale statewide. And so that's a key component because it scales the benefits to beyond the community that will be served by that microgrid. The benefits of that microgrid and the learnings are going to be able to be scaled statewide, but we are focusing, the initial investment in our disadvantaged communities because equity is a key component to the energy policy framework in California. And looking at the communities that we're targeting here, these are often communities that have faced a lack of investment from energy utilities, have faced a lack of investment even from their local governments. And so it was very important for California to apply that equity lens to the microgrid incentive program to put the focus there first, to deploy the latest technology in this disadvantaged communities, and then work on scaling those learnings outside of those communities. I wanted to also talk about kind of our third layer here, which is work that is ongoing. So on the value of resiliency. And so the value of resiliency component of our proceeding is really focused on how do we help to standardize how a customer, that might be a community, that might be a commercial and industrial customer, how do we help them understand what the value of investing in a microgrid is for them in particular? And that's really important because, as I said earlier, sometimes microgrids are marketed as this panacea for all customers, get everyone a microgrid, but that really is not the most cost-effective way of deploying the microgrid as a strategy. We want to give customers options, but we want customers to be able to understand what a microgrid means to them. Do they really need a microgrid? And so that value of resiliency work has kicked off in California, and that's going to be a key component to broad scale commercialization so that customers really understand, is a microgrid the right solution for them? Also, metrics, tools, and methodologies. This has been a key component of our microgrid and resiliency working group. And so, these are metrics and tools that customers will be able to use in order to have a structured way of understanding the value of microgrids for them. Next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about our formal process of implementation. So we opened our rulemaking in 2019. And so this is the formal proceeding. We have many stakeholders in this proceeding, ranging from environmental and social justice groups, microgrid developers, ratepayer advocates, all in one formal setting. So that proceeding has an administrative law judge, and all of the key staff are working there under the leadership of the commissioner. And so that's been a key part of my role. I mentioned the working group already. That's the informal component of our proceeding that really allows stakeholders to roll up their sleeves, bring ideas to the table, hash out proposals to bring to the formal process. And so I think a lot of the success of our proceeding has been leveraging both the formal process as well as the informal process. And the development of the microgrid working group was actually a component of the legislation. That often isn't there, but it happened to be a component of the legislation here. So I wanted to also talk about kind of the three structural components of the formal proceeding. And so first were tariff changes. And so this was a key component of the legislation and has been really, one of the first things that we tackled in the proceeding. And so, tariffs, at their core are really, the rules of engagement between a customer and the utility. And I know that Dawn and Sam talked about how, microgrids are all very unique, but we really needed to create a more streamlined process for microgrids in California in order to foster an ecosystem where they could be heavily commercialized. And so as part of the proceeding, we developed what we called a template-based application process for behind the meter projects. And so this was really important to help customers prioritize the way that they were developing their microgrids, as well as streamlining and expediting applications, particularly for interconnection that went to the utilities. So a challenge that we had heard about from developers and customers is, they have their application in place, they turn it into the utility, and the utility says, oh, you need to bring us this other thing. It turned into sometimes a bring me a rock exercise. And that's what we really wanted to avoid. So the first part of our proceeding was this creation of the template-based application process so that customers would be able to interact and engage with their utility in a streamlined and uniform way. In addition to that, the legislation required us to reduce barriers. And so we took a couple of really key steps and authorizations in the proceeding to implement that component of the legislation. So one was authorizing the utilities to add dedicated staff. And these dedicated staff were focused on the distribution planning teams at the utilities and really specializing in resiliency project development for local jurisdictions. And so that was really important so that the interconnection queues wouldn't just keep building and building. And so the utilities were able to hire more staff to be able to look at these microgrid applications that were coming in and help customers, particularly local jurisdictions that wanted to develop microgrids. We also had to change our existing tariffs around charging of energy storage systems. And so we had rules in place that required energy storage systems to be charging, when we had excessive solar on the grid, because we don't want energy storage systems to charge when we're running our natural gas facilities, because that inevitably creates an additional greenhouse gas emission component to energy storage that we're trying to reduce. But we did make an exception to charging energy storage systems in advance of a public safety power shutoff. And so in those situations, the utilities are giving customers 36 hours in advance that a notice that a public safety power shutoff is going to happen. And so a customer will be allowed to charge their energy storage system, even if it's at a peak time when natural gas is running on the system. In addition to that, another immediate tariff revision we had to do with removing storage sizing limits related to microgrids that are running on a net energy metering tariff. And so previously, there were sizing limits to storage that were limited based on peak customer use. And so customers were able to increase the size of their storage on site and able to better leverage their microgrid for a resiliency purpose, a potential multi-day outage. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the creation of the data portal that specifically allowed local jurisdictions as well as tribal governments to access information about the transmission and distribution grid to better understand what their microgrid needs were. And this included a specific new program for Pacific Gas and Electric Company, who was suffering from a number of PSPSs, where they started a community microgrid enablement program, which didn't pay for the microgrid itself, but it helped to pay for upgrades to the distribution system that might be necessary that would typically have to be paid for by the customer. So this helped better equip customers to invest in a microgrid because their distribution system that corresponded with their community had also been upgraded. So those were the primary components of the legislation that we were able to implement. And then the next steps that we've talked about now are implementation of the microgrid incentive program. We're also working on the creation of a standardized microgrid tariff, which is really important. But again, there's a key component there about making sure that there isn't a shifting of costs. So that's a big component of the creation of a multi-property tariff, which would allow a microgrid to serve multiple customers, not just one customer. I also wanted to talk about one short-term change that we made last year related to standby charges. And so just this is a component here of a fixed charge that right now we've reduced for customers to see how much of the fixed charge are we able to do away with and allow a commercial customer to have a microgrid. I got Dan's note that we're running up on time, so I wanted to turn it back over to him. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luam. It is very much groundbreaking stuff, that work that you are doing on this issue in California and implementing the requirements set forth under Senate Bill 1339. So thank you for getting that. Unfortunately, we are right up on the hour mark. And so I don't think we are going to have time for questions in the at the moment. But for anyone who did submit a question in the chat, we will respond following the webinar to provide that information. I can say that there is funding in the IIJA that microgrids can access. With that, I think I want to thank our speakers once again for their time and effort that went into this webinar. We appreciate the expertise that each of you were able to provide. And of course, thanks to all the attendees for participating. As a reminder, a recording and the presentation slides will be made available shortly following in the next several days. Do keep an eye out for that email, and also for emails and notifications regarding the 2 other resilience webinars and our new microgrid report. Our next webinar in the NRI series will be on May 5th. That will look at how states have worked to pass laws aimed at improving pedestrian and cyclist safety. To register or find out more information, please visit ncsl.org or send Kristen Hildreth an email at the address that you see on the screen. Thank you for your interest and participation, and for your continued support of NCSL and the work that we do. Have a great day, everyone.